All right, one of the more common things I see, or one of the more common questions I get is, hey, Dr. Baker, I have gone on a carnivore diet and I've had a lot of good things happen to me. Maybe I've lost 50 pounds, maybe, I feel 20 years younger, my gut feels better, my autoimmune condition has resolved, my joints don't ache, my mood's better, on and on. But
Here we go. So Sean is basically saying, don't worry about biomarkers that are inexorably linked to heart disease or diabetes or anything. Just focus on how you feel. So if you start doing like drugs like cocaine and you feel great, like $1 million, and you're vibing, you're able to work longer and harder than ever before, your mood is elevated. Don't listen to anybody telling you that cocaine's bad for you. Clearly, you're feeling better taking cocaine, so just keep taking cocaine. That's basically the argument he's making. If your cholesterol is through the fucking roof, regardless of how well you feel, guess what? You're at high risk for heart disease. So you should probably do something about that.
my cholesterol is high. My doctor is concerned and he wants to put me on a statin medication because my LDL cholesterol is some high number, and I'm really concerned about that. And am I going to have heart disease? And this is a question we often are faced with. And I think, in light of some recent data that has come out, particularly this lean mass hyperresponder baseline data, I think.
Oh my god. Okay, so he is misinterpreting the research. What this research shows is that some people can have elevated cholesterol not due necessarily to the saturated fat or cholesterol they're consuming, but due to the macronutrient composition of their diet. So just eating low carb alone, regardless of an increase in saturated fat or cholesterol in your diet, can increase your serum cholesterol score. What that research did not show was that if you have elevated cholesterol due to being on a low carb diet, that won't increase your risk of heart disease. That is not what the research suggested. So this is the type of mental gymnastics and gaslighting that carnivore idiots will fucking try to do. There will be this problem, like elevated cholesterol increases your risk of heart disease. And then rather than trying to provide evidence, suggesting the contrary, they'll try to draw your attention to some red herring that has nothing to do with the problem and say, oh, well, the only reason your cholesterol is elevated is because you're eating low carb. Well, what does that have to do with anything? High cholesterol causes heart disease. Who cares what the cause is? If high cholesterol causes heart disease, it doesn't matter if your cholesterol is high due to genetics, due to you eating low carb, due to a high saturated fat diet, not exercising, being overweight. If it's elevated, you're at a higher risk for heart disease.
I think it's helpful to review my thoughts on that and what I think is something that may be helpful for you. First of all, I don't tell people to ignore LDL cholesterol. I know there's people out there that say LDL cholesterol has nothing to do with heart disease. It's not part of it's not part of the causal pathway. It's the firemen that are coming to put out the fire, and therefore we should ignore it completely.
That is a ridiculously stupid argument. The firemen putting out the fire thing. Cholesterol doesn't have it doesn't heal endothelial cell damage. So no, that's just not true.
And that may be true. It may be perhaps true.
No, it's
I don't
not.
think the evidence that's out there at this point can unquestionably confirm that. Now,
Yeah, no. Not only do we have randomized trials, but we have very, very long-term, very large-scale prospective cohorts. And we also have Mendelian randomization studies proving that high cholesterol is its own independent risk factor for heart disease. So he's just, again, gaslighting tactic. Oh, we don't know. The research isn't quite there yet. This is the same strategy the tobacco industry used to gaslight people into, thinking cigarette smoking is safe. Rather than just trying to say, oh, that's not true, they try to confuse you by saying, well, the research isn't there, nobody knows. We do know. Cholesterol causes heart disease.
My sort of opinion, and I will say this very loudly, it's an opinion based upon my observations and how I sort of see things going. Now, the lean mass hyperresponder baseline data has sort of further, I guess, convinced me of that. But I do think that LDL cholesterol becomes more of a dependent variable. What do I mean by that? Well,
it's not a dependent variable. We have Mendelian randomization studies proving that it's its own independent risk factor.
LDL cholesterol is high and you are like the average American, then you're probably more likely and more apt to develop cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, so this guy is, again, just gaslighting people just because there are other confounding variables that can increase your heart disease risk. That doesn't mean cholesterol is not an independent variable. It just means there are other risk factors involved. So cholesterol on its own is a risk factor, but also being overweight, being a smoker, being diabetic, those things can also increase your risk further. That doesn't mean cholesterol is not an independent risk factor and heart disease will only present if you're overweight, smoker, or diabetic. No, again, we have long-term epidemiological research and Mendelian randomization studies proving this. Even among people who are at a healthy body weight, don't drink, don't smoke, exercise regularly, if they have elevated cholesterol, they're at increased risk of heart disease.
But what if you fall into this lean mass hyperresponder cohort, which the criticism is it's extremely rare. Oh, it's only like 1% of 1% of the population, 1 in 1,000 people or something like that.
Okay, again, this guy doesn't understand the study.
Are people that have high LDL cholesterol and low triglycerides and high HDL and overall lean body mass. They're so rare that we could basically ignore that data. I think what we're going to find is that one, it's not that rare, and two, I think the same physiology.
The lean mass hyperresponder study did not show that high cholesterol is not a risk factor for heart disease among people who have high cholesterol due to being on a low carbohydrate diet.
That many people on low carb diets do see their triglycerides coming down. Many people on low carb diets see their LDL rising, right? That's one of the big knocks around these sort of ketogenic or low carb carnivore diets. But if the physiology is basically the same thing, then I think the relative protection conferred by that, and again, this is the lean mass hyperresponder. I'm trying not to be too technical here, but they basically showed that people with really, really high LDL cholesterol had effectively no heart disease, or very little to none.
No, that's not what they showed.
Not what would be expected, even after many, many years of being on this diet. The critics, again, are saying it's a rare group. It doesn't apply to very many people.
This guy did not read the study.
And the time period was insufficient. Now that is, the principal author of that study would disagree with that because he's literally an expert on how to measure this stuff and says, no, we should have been able to pick up significant cardiovascular disease, which wasn't shown. And so, there's some other interesting data points out there.
This guy is
just, we're going to see,
oh my God,
eventually. And why do I say eventually? Yes, there's going to be more data that I think is going to be more compelling. I think the lean mass hyperresponder follow-up data is going to be very compelling. I think it's going to further sort of reinforce this idea I'm talking about. But I mean, there's other data. For instance, there's a class of medication called the SGLT2 inhibitor. It's often given to diabetics to dramatically lower their blood glucose, right? It makes you pee out all the glucose. SGLT2 is a sodium glucose transporter, right? And so the glucose is dramatically peed out, but guess what? That drug has a reduction in cardiovascular outcomes, right? Or negative outcomes.
Yeah, no shit, because it helps treat their diabetes. That doesn't mean fucking LDL is not a risk factor.
So that alone, but guess what it also does? In many cases, it raises LDL cholesterol. So you got a drug that lowers
Oh my god, dude. Like, this guy just does not have any fucking critical thinking skills. Just because you're in a situation where it can increase your LDL, but it lowers your risk of heart disease, that just means the confounding variable in that particular situation was more important than the reduction in LDL. Doesn't mean LDL isn't its own independent risk factor for heart disease.
Glucose, but can tend to raise LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular events go down. So maybe it's more about taking care of the metabolic side of things, right? Some people will say, well, the initiation of cardiovascular disease is some sort of vascular trauma, vascular damage, vascular inflammatory effect.
So again, there's research on this. Inflammation at best is a weak predictor for heart disease. It's clearly not very important in the causal chain.
So the endothelium, the lining of those vessels is somehow damaged, and then we start subsequent to that to see all the compensatory change that leads to the atherosclerotic disease, maybe the sort of the inundation of cholesterol and the foamy macrophages and whatnot. And without that inflammatory inciting event, there would be no significant
Cool story, bro. Where's the evidence?
cardiovascular disease, right? And that's sort of the bone of contention between these groups. Some people say just the LDL itself isn't.
Like, by the way, you can find chain smokers who avoid getting heart disease because their cholesterol is low enough. So if inflammation was the end all be all, you wouldn't see those types of people.
Enough to cause damage, and then it goes from there. And there's other people who are saying, wait a minute, maybe not in this situation. And I think I'm in the latter category. Well, I know I am. So how do I approach it at this point? Well, I tell people if your LDL cholesterol is significantly elevated, first of all, look at the rest of your metabolic health. Because if that's bad too, then that's really a problem. But if it's isolated, elevated, and everything else is fine, you're lean, you're fit, you're normal blood glucose, normal blood pressure, low inflammatory.
So again, this is basically like saying, I'm fit, I exercise, I eat well, so I don't know, doing cocaine should be fine for me. Or, I don't know, having an elevated liver enzyme count, who cares? Or having like a super elevated creatinine level indicating like kidney failure, oh, that's fine. Because, all these other metabolic markers are fine. Like, no. So just because you're otherwise healthy and then there's like this, one outlier, that doesn't mean you should just ignore that outlier.
Markers, low triglycerides, on and on and on. Then I would say at that point, get some imaging, particularly if you're over, say, age 40. Get a CAC score or something along those lines, just to give you some level of idea where you stand metabolically, and are you someone that has that.
Yes, take advice from the guy who got his medical license taken away. He's definitely the doctor or not doctor you should listen to.
Capacity to have disease. Now, a lot of people say, well, I got a CAC score, it was 0. Mine was 0. I did mine, I think 6 years ago.
He's bragging about having a CAC of 0. Half the people in his age category have a CAC of 0. That's not uncommon.
It's been a while. I need to do another one just to see if there's been any progression, which I think I'll do later this year. But, a lot of people say, well, what if I got a score and it was not 0? It was 100 or 150. Well, in that situation, I think, it becomes very important to check it again, right? Get a serial exam to see which direction it's going in, and what you want to do with regard to, LDL levels and so on and so forth is a little bit more complicated, I would say, for sure. So anyway, that's what my thoughts are for now. I don't think we should ignore LDL cholesterol, but I do think the evidence is starting to show that it is going to be a dependent variable, and that there are going to be people where perhaps it's not a big deal. And I think that's, again, I can't say that 100% definitively, but I am sort of
Yeah, you know, I'm just a doctor who worked as a surgeon who didn't specialize in cardiology and got my medical license taken away because, you know, a medical board found that I was doing surgeries improperly. So I'm definitely the one to listen to about this. What a clown. Dude, I just genuinely loathe Sean Baker. On the Neo G7, when I